Have you ever noticed that when you're working on a render, the realism that you get does not increase smoothly as you spend more and more time working on it, but rather it does so in these large steps, from 0 to somewhere around 20%, then to 40%, 60, 80, and hopefully by the end of your journey it's at around 95%. In this video I'll talk about these 5 jumps and how you can focus on them to make your renders as good as they can be. Here you see on the screen a D5 scene that has everything set up. All materials are there, all geometry is there, cameras are framed, but still the scene is at this 0% realism mark. And let's bring it to first 20%. And it always starts with light. With a harsh midday sun and generally overexposed image, everything looks quite plasticky and fake, so that's the thing that we'll need to adjust, right? And before I go in here and start changing the light angles and so on, I will actually use one of the presets that D5 is providing to anyone who's using D5 Render. By the way, D5 are also sponsoring this video. Thank you so much. If I go here to the Studio tool, rollout, here under D5 curated all presets, you can see all of the different types of environment effects, which is light and generally speaking the color balancing, HDRIs, the backdrop image and so on, that are already prepared for you. And you can just simply go through these and find the one that you would like to use, right? And for this I will use exterior cloudy. I feel like a cloudy effect here with a little bit of light shining through would do quite well. So I'll double click on it and just simply applies it like so. Right? So with those 2 clicks, now we're at, first 10%, and now I'll just make some slight adjustments to make it better. So just looking through these different settings here currently we're using an HDRI skylight, or not skylight, but HDRI type of lighting our scene and a custom-made HDRI map. I can adjust the skylight as well as the backdrop to fit with what I want. So I think I'll increase the background just a slightly more to make it brighter. I'll also go and change the color temperature to a little bit colder here and a little bit colder for the sun as well. Notice how the sun is also being used and it's following along with the HDRI image with the stick mark right here. Very streamlined, very nice. If I decrease the sunlight intensity, I think, yeah, so those areas will be a little bit more, they will seem a little bit more overcast. And now let's just rotate the whole thing to find an angle that works better. Feel like, oh, that's very harsh. Let's find something like, yeah, something like so will do the trick. Some areas in the front are lit up, then we have a break with a shadow, and then second plan is lit up, and then we have a nice sliding shadow here on the building, right? Then if I go further here, you can see that there's an option for fog, and for this I do want to increase the fog. I want this to be a little bit more of a foggy morning daytime render. So let's go for something like that, and also let's increase the volume, or rather let's enable the volume light, because this makes it so that the light bounces inside of the fog, and we kind of need it for this to be a little bit more accurate. And it's okay if the image looks desaturated. We will be able to work on it a little bit later on once we'll start working with the effects. So I kind of like how this looks. I feel like adding rain would do this justice. So it's kind of rainy, but the rain is about to stop, the whole idea of these wet leaves kind of gets me. So I'll turn on the rain. Yeah, this will work, but later. For now, we're only talking about the light, right? And this is, the first 20% of our journey. Alright, so now with the light done, it's time to actually change up the exposure settings, and you know, balance out the scene even further. So right now this scene right here is a little bit over bright, a little bit, you know, on the brighter side. So I'll bump it down to, let's go for minus 0.2, something like that. And also I will change the shadow local exposure, which is, by the way, highlight local exposure and shadow local exposure are tools available in the newer versions of D5, starting with 2.6. And if I change this to 0.5, something like that, you can see that all of the shadows have been raised. And I can also do the same thing with the highlights to clamp them down, but the highlights are not clipping, they're not reaching the end of the spectrum, right? So I don't really need to do so. I also want to, actually I kind of want to bring the highlights in a little bit to make them a little bit more poppy. So if I go back to environment and I change the backdrop image to be a bit brighter, 0.05, you know, it's going to give me a stronger silhouette of the building, of the scene. Not that the silhouette is impressive or anything like that, but generally speaking, the composition, you know, the central line and the pathway, that's just gonna work a little bit better with a brighter backdrop. So back to the effects tab, if I go in here and I change up the highlights, if I increase the highlights tab, I can keep bumping it up until I will see some clipping where, you know, it's starting to burn out, and then I'll stop. So something like 0.75 should do the trick. Yeah, something like that. Generally speaking, you want a pretty low contrast image rendered out from like a raw render. You want it to be pretty low contrast so that you can bump up the contrast later on in Photoshop or any other software that you're using. So I'm not too concerned about this looking washed out, that is fine. Then if we look at vignette, I kind of want a stronger vignette, so I'll use 0.5 for this. You know, just it's not important, but it is what it is. And then for the light, or for the color balance itself, I think it's fine. It could be a little bit colder, but we will manage this before we actually render out. So in terms of the colors, I won't look at it as much. I'm just looking at the tones. Then the last one, color saturation. I just said that I'm not looking at the colors. I will be bumping it up a little bit, back to 0 probably. No, actually minus 0.1 was fine. Okay, so, you know, small adjustments, but quite necessary to, you know, prepare for the export, so to say. And I would consider that this image right now has been moved from 0% realism to 20% realism. And now I will go through the rest, balance them out, and then we will move on to chapter 2, I guess, which is going to be moving from 20 to 40%. Alright, so one last thing that I want to show you before we move on to the next step is a very powerful tool that came together with D5 2.6, and that is AI Atmosphere Matching Tool. So up until now, you could only use templates to quickly overwrite all of the environment settings that you see here on the right-hand side, all in one go. But now with AI matching, AI Atmosphere Match Tool, which is this icon right here, you can upload literally any image, for instance, this image right here, onto it. There we go. Snap the print screen of your current view, like that, and generate a potential setting range on how to transfer the style of this image to be closer to the style of the image that you have uploaded. So let me hit apply. It takes a little bit of time to migrate the style, and it starts adjusting all of the different settings and so on, trying to figure out the light angle, blah, blah, blah. But once it is done, it also applies color correction. There we go. And now if I were to drag on top the image that I have here, I would argue that the image is still a little bit warmer than what we have here, but damn, this is pretty convincing. I mean, this is pretty cool, pretty close, right? So this is a new way of how you can also, you know, override all of the settings all at once and then make fine adjustments by yourselves. I think this is good implementation of AI in a software package. So just wanted to point it out to all of you who are using the newest version, that now you can do this. Very nice. On to the next step. So in terms of realism, the very important notion or thing to understand is that transitions and seams and corners are all very important aspects to, how realistic a scene is. So for example here, and let me break out a little bit from the camera, if I were to look at the seam right here, that's bad. The inner corner, that's bad. That is not realistic at all. The gaps right here are a little bit too high. That's not realistic at all again. And specifically the gap between the ground, let me zoom out a bit, and the two ground conditions right here, that is not realistic at all. So we need to somehow break away that line and make it a little bit more realistic, a little bit less seamed. Another thing to note is the corners. Right now I already have applied chamfer to all of these bricks, but if I were to, let me actually show you how it was before. So if I look at this material in particular and I turn off round corner, kind of just walk about, oops, that's too fast, sorry, coming back. See how there is no corner for the light to catch. So it all starts looking very synthetic again. If I go back in here, and this is a built-in tool in D5, a very powerful tool, I can select this brick here and I can choose to have round corners, and I'm using 5mm radius for it. You can see that now there is this slight edge where the light catches, and this edge makes all of the difference, right? So that's about corners, right? In D5, you should figure out which edges of the scene should catch light, and then make sure that you're using rounded corners for those particular edges, right? And I believe it works with most of the types of materials, but generally speaking, in architecture, we mostly use custom or displaced materials, right? On to a more important note, that is the seams between different materials, how to hide them. Well, there's no easy way. The easiest way for me, at least to suggest to you, is to actually scatter the rocks onto here and scatter some grass onto the grassy patch, right? So that the rocks and the grass kind of intersect. And for this, I don't think I need to explain it too much. So instead, we will do a quick time lapse for me to show you how big of a difference does it make. So give me a second. All right, there we go. With just a few scatters of the foliage on the left-hand side and the stones on the in the middle portion, as well as some leaves everywhere, I have managed to break away the seams between the different land areas, I guess. And just being able to break that apart, and let me try to zoom into at least a portion of it. For instance, right here, right? Just being able to break that even slightly apart increases how believable the scene is dramatically. So I strongly encourage you to, in areas where the camera is close to the objects, to actually use scatter rather than using, clear separation line and two different displacements or two different materials. It is much more costly in terms of rendering times, but it's all worth it. So that is about the transitions, and what I mean about solving the transitions, solving the corners, and solving the seams between the different objects. I will quickly show you how now the new and updated versions of these look like. So you can see that. This one. And I would be considered these renders to be like 40% of the way there. It's not halfway there, but it's kind of getting in the realm of, being believable. That This one is just a lawn, but I feel like it looks fine, so I'm gonna keep it. This one and this one right here. And I've just noticed that scene 4, I forgot to actually change the proportion for scene 4, so I'll need to really quickly reframe it as well. 1920 960, if I believe, if I remember correctly. Does this frame fine? It seems like it is framing fine, so I'll just save it as it is. There we go. So now we're ready to move on to our third step, 40 to 60%. Let's go. All right, so let's talk about reflections, and specifically, what are the reflective elements in your scene actually showing, actually reflecting? I have noticed that specifically, or especially, the beginners in rendering are making this mistake of polishing the hell out of the scene itself, right? All of the intricate details and everything like that, but really ignoring anything that is behind the scene. And I have this particular scene right here, which shows that, in my opinion, quite well, with this window on the right-hand side right here. It indicates that the world just ends, right? And if we were to tilt our cameras, we would not see anything, right? So you really need to be mindful of how much information do your windows in your ArcViz environments, do they actually reflect and show to the viewer, right? And we will be just constructing that for every individual scene. I don't feel like there's any science behind it. You just need stuff. You just need to add geometries. So instead of me kind of blabbing through the process, I'll just do another time lapse for it. And that's simple as that. Let me just show you real quick what has been done, just to guide you through the process. There we go, 3 layers, or maybe 4 layers. The closest tree, further, even further away, and the furthest away, right? And the furthest trees, I'm just using an image because it really doesn't matter. The reflection, the fuzziness in the reflection will hide all of the, weird inconsistencies and so on. And one thing that I would like to talk about this real quick is that this is the original asset that you get from the asset library of D5, and this is a modified version of it. And the way I have modified it is very simple. It uses the base color of autumn leaves material, right? Autumn trees material. And I'm just using a base color that is this greenish, that has this greenish tint to bring it back to late summer rather than autumn, right? And I could, increase it, and so on. So you can control the hue or a tint of the hue by just changing the base color of your base color map. Quite useful. Okay, now let's get back to let's go for scene 3 and talk about other things. So right here, it's gonna be pretty hard to discuss, but just like with the reflections, there's also shadows that are being casted on the scene, in the first plan. And here it's not as prominent, but right here, I would like to have some sort of object just off the distance to cast shadow on the facade so that it breaks apart this kind of a rhythm of this particular facade. So I will be adding in a tree right off the, right off the corner right here. Not necessarily a tree, but some form of vegetation. I'm looking into this tree, but it's part of a group, so let me just find one that I feel like would fit quite nicely. And a pretty small one as well. Perhaps a shrub would do better. That looks kind of nice. Okay, I'll try this one. Just for the sake of speed, I will be, adding in a pretty random tree to here. There we go. Download it. Add it in, escape out of that, and just simply position it. I can just click on this camera slot for scene 4 to actually see, what the camera sees. And if I click on this, oh, you don't see it, sorry. And if I click on this little pin here, now the camera, even if I select the tree, sorry, other way around. If I click on this pin right here and it shows up as not crossed over, if I deselect the camera and select the tree, the pin will still show up. And now I can move the tree in place to just get the shadowing here. Perhaps we need a slightly larger tree, but you get what I mean, right? If I go back now to scene 4, there's a shadow that is being cast by the tree onto the facade. I will do a really quick time lapse to just make sure that it all works nicely. Okay, there we go. So let me just make myself actually smaller. I think it's time to be not as prominent on the screen. So now we have a cascading shadow right here that aligns with the light angle right here. So the composition is starting to get there and it's becoming a little bit more interesting, a little bit more nice. I am going to check if this has rounded corners. It does not, so I will add rounded corners to this seam as well. There we go. That is done. So this is reflections and a little bit of a bonus of the shadows falling from the outside of the scene. Generally speaking, you want stuff outside of the scene to actually influence the scene itself. Makes it nicer, right? Okay, on to the next one. All right, variance and imperfections. So first things first, even though we are using the shadow here, this is still very much, perfectly tiled. This is an issue. This is way too uniform. This is too clean. This is too clean. Everything is a little bit too clean. So I'll guide you through the methods that I use to break away the cleanliness, and then as per usual, we'll do a time lapse. First things first, it's going to be actually not in this particular scene, but in here. This tiling right here, these steps, if I were to look at them from a little bit of a, there we go, steeper angle, notice the seam that is running along here, and then and here, everything is just being repeated. The same texture is being repeated. So what we will use in these kind of examples, where we just need it to be broken apart and not as prominently repeated, is we're going to use a trick called randomize UVs, which is built in D5. Again, another really good tool. So if I select this object right here, you can see that right now it's set to be a displacement object, right? It's as if it's being displaced, but we're not really even using a height map for it. So I'm not sure what is it that it's actually displacing, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to change the material template from displacement onto custom. So these objects become associated with a custom material rather than a displacement material, and this gives us much more settings. The most interesting one being the UV randomizer. If I tick mark this, notice how this seam that we had here just goes away. It's not there anymore. Now the whole object or the whole tiling has been randomized. I believe they are using a Warren pattern for the randomization, which is great, so there's no more rectilinear tiling. Of course, this will not work on, I can show you, there we go. We have the material template custom set to this facade, and if I do UV randomizer, not the best. So for stuff that is organic or non-organic, for stuff that needs to be very strictly placed, you can't do UV randomizer. It's just going to break it completely, right? So it's only for organic things and kind of grainy things, if you know what I mean. So then the question is, how do you break this apart? Well, you need to add layers of information on top of it to hide the repetitiveness of the materials. And you do so by going to assets, by going to under model, scroll down until you see decals or decals, I never know how to pronounce those, and adding decals to as a additional stencil, additional layer to insinuate that there's some damage on this edge, for instance, or on this edge, and so on. So I'll do one, and then we will kind of skip ahead with me just quickly adding them in a time lapse. So let's go for damaged walls stencil, or actually, what about water stains? Water stains, I assume later. For now, damaged walls. damaged walls, and we just download any one that we want. This one seems a little bit too intense, so I'm going to get this one instead. And notice, I mean, these are pro version, stencils. You can get a free stencil from Quixel Megascans. If you're following this channel, you know this already, but Quixel Megascans, just search on the internet, provides you with a free library of these kind of stencils, materials, and so on. But the pro version just has them built in, which is very, very convenient. Okay, enough blabbing. So I just drag and drop it in, or I click and then I click again in the scene on where I want to drop in the stencil. I'll close this for a second. And let me just move it around so that you can see better. I think it's going to be visible better on this particular object. And you can see as I'm moving this around, it pops in here on this concrete patch, right? Or concrete frame, I should say. Also, it's way too prominent, way too strong. So I'm going to select the stencil and I'm just going to apply, instead of opacity 1, I'll apply 0.5, like half of the opacity. We really don't want it to be that strong, maybe 0.6, just slightly stronger. I'm going to go around and I'll add stencils to all of the surfaces where I see them fit, and then we will continue from there. So another time lapse. There it is. Okay, I have finished adding in all of the irregularities and so on. One last thing before we move on to the next stage that I want to talk about is the glass, right? So adding in irregularities to the glass is a little bit more tricky, but it can be done. And I have added a little bit here, and hopefully it will show up once we actually render it out. But basically, what we have here is a roughness map that is attached to the glass material itself. And then let me just try and fish out the roughness map to show to you. This is the roughness map. Let me make it smaller. You can see some fingerprints, some like streaks and so on. It's basically the position of minerals on top of a glass surface. And of course, the brighter the areas, the less reflective or more rough it becomes, right? So that's the logic, and that's why the glass currently is a little bit freaking out, because the roughness map is not letting it converge and not letting it render out properly. We'll see. Hopefully it's gonna render out once we hit that render button. Anyway, enough blah blah blah. Let's move on. We're at 80%. I would say this, I would call this kinda 80% of the way there. Now we'll move on to the last step, with which I will hopefully be able to bring, the whole thing to above 90%. And I'll talk about why we can't reach 100 in the next step. See you there. All right, so the last part is non-technical. It's a little bit harder to talk about, and actually let's hide the preview of the decals, the asset preview. So the last step is getting the atmosphere of the visuals right, and then using color grading and so on to really bring it forward and make it filmic. And in this step, we do a lot of work out of D5, but also there's still some work to be done in D5. So let me guide you through it. Step 1 is to get rid of all of this overly sharp, all of the sharpness. We will be applying a little bit of Photoshop shenanigans to this as well, but what already you can do in D5 is apply depth of field to each of the cameras for each of the scenes. So let's do that. I'll click on Edit Camera here for this scene 5, and I will tick mark depth of field. I will enable it. right? I will click on this set focus and I'll decide on what is the object on which I would like to focus on. And I would say probably this tree right here, right? Once that is done, it gives me the focus distance. I can just increase the blur to basically blur out the backdrop. And you can see, with blur set to 10, it's pretty intense. So let's drop it down to something like 8. Yeah, that's a little bit more reasonable. The blur does fix a few over-sharpened issues in the backdrop as well as the front, the areas that are closest to us, but it doesn't really fix the issues that we have around the object that we are focusing on. We will use Photoshop for that. So this is kind of step 1 or first thing that we need to do. Second thing, and I'll of course be doing it for all of them, as per usual, we'll have the time lapse for us to do so. So the camera is done. Camera is locked in, it's ready to go, it's fine, it's done. Second thing is I talked about wanting it to be a rainy morning or rainy day right before the rain breaks, right? That feeling, that atmosphere. So I'm aiming for that, and for this I need everything to be wet, right? So I'm going to apply precipitation, hard word for me, precipitation filter on this, which is either rain or snow. And you can immediately see, yep, that's rain. So with one click of a button, we're changing all of the material, not transparency, reflectivity of all of the materials to be highly reflective, and there's puddles and so on, and you can make adjustments, of course, for it as well, and I will do so. So wait, what's that? Oh yeah, that's the amount of rain. So you can go from very high to, medium. I will go for pretty intense, and then the strength, I will decrease the strength of it just a tiny bit. Give it a second to catch up. And this seems like it's going to do just fine. At this stage, it's pretty hard to know because the render kind of stops a little bit early on, so what we're getting is a pretty noisy image, but this seems to be quite okay. I'll let it be, right? So we say that this is ready to be photoshopped, we lock it in, update scene, and we're good to go. And I'll just go through every scene right now in a time lapse. I'll render them out as 4K images. I should probably talk about this as well. I will be rendering them out under image, mode, image, aspect ratio, original, preset size 4K. Wait, aspect ratio. Yeah, sure. Preset size 4K, or we can use a custom preset. And I will be outputting several channels. Main one being, I don't care about the sky mask actually. I do care about the Z depth as well as AO. So I will be exporting those ones as well. Material ID could be useful, but for this particular example, I will not be using material ID. And then my format is going to be EXR RAW format, right? We will be using RAW, but that's a little bit later. And of course, I will adjust the 960 times 2 is 1920. Yeah, that's actually correct. Yeah, so this is correct. Yeah, everything's fine, and I can just hit the render button. But before I do so, as I said, I will adjust all of the other scenes. So time lapse time. All right, here we go. So this is rendered out finally, and not just this one. I have rendered out every single image or every single scene that we have, but I'll be talking mostly about this one. So I tend to render out JPEG images. So all of these, this one, and this one are JPEGs. And I've rendered out one EXR image, which is 32-bit, just to show you the difference in how you color grade things. But generally speaking, since I like to set everything up in the, in the engine, right? And to get a result that is as close to what I want as possible, I tend to render out simply JPEGs. Right, so first of all, let's work on this scene in particular, right? So this is going to be a 8-bit workflow, right? Together with this image right here, we also have AO, as well as, let me just find it, there we go, ambient occlusion pass, this one right here, as well as the Z-depth pass, which is this one right here. Both of these can be Control A, Control C, Control V into here. Both of these can be layered on top of an already existing image to give it more oomph, right? So the way the ambient occlusion works is basically it adds shading or shadows to inner corners of the geometry, right? So you can darken the deep areas of your image. And I tend to hit the ambient occlusion pass with levels adjustment and then just simply crank the white range a little bit towards the left hand side. So basically overburn these areas because I don't want them to be that prominent. So something like this, right? Let me zoom in to show you what's up. So once you have something like this in terms of contrast, then what you also want to do is give it a little bit of, actually this one does not really need it, but a little bit of blurring if what you're getting is overly sharp. In this case, it doesn't feel like it's overly sharp, maybe in these areas right here. So I am going to give it like filter, blur, Gaussian blur, and just like 0.3 pixels of blur, just slightly softening it up. Once this is done, we can zoom out and change the blending mode of this to multiply, right? Now let me show you the difference, right? This is with, 1 second, zoom out. This is with multiply. This is without. With, without. See, it gives you this a little bit more depth to all of the foliage. Of course, now this is a complete overkill, right? This is 100% opacity multiplication. So we want to drop down the opacity to something a little bit more reasonable, like 30% or even less, 20. Yep, looks fine, looks good to me. So that's the first step. That's the ambient occlusion. Then in terms of the Z depth, right? Let's copy, paste this. The Z depth is basically fog. Right? You can also use it to defocus things, but we use Z-depth as fog mostly, right? So let me hit it with levels as well again, and let me just bring in the blacks right onto where our range starts, right? So I can clamp where the fog is most prominent, right? Basically in the back. And then I can bring in the back a bit, yeah, to something like this, right? So fog is applied through the screen modifier or blending mode, or you can also use linear dodge or add modifier, whichever you prefer. I prefer to use screen for this, and of course drop down the opacity dramatically just to give it a little bit more depth, something like this. All right. So now with these two layers done, we can actually go back into our image and start color correcting it. So the first thing that I want to do is I want the greens that we have here to be a little bit more intense, or a little bit more, to have a little bit more impact. So I'm going to hit it, not Control L, sorry. I'm going to hit it with Control U, which is hue saturation. I'll filter through the greens, and I'll just increase their saturation up to see what we're dealing with. Okay, so these are the areas which are going to be increased. I'm just going to give it like +10 saturation and -4 lightness. Something like that. No, don't need to do too much with it. Seems to be okay. Right? Just looking at this image, still a little bit undersaturated, so I'll go to Image, Adjustments. Let's try Vibrance, and just increase the vibrance ever so slightly. +13, maybe a little bit more, +20. Yeah, there we go. That's kind of good. Okay, so now we have an image that is quite well balanced in my opinion. It's fine. The darks could be a little bit darker, so I'm going to just hit it with Control L, and I'll just bring in the blacks a little bit closer to the middle, something like that. Maybe a bit less. Actually, yeah, something like that. That's good. And the last bit is, you know, fixing the overly sharp areas that you can clearly see once you actually zoom in, right? So we're at 200% zoom, and this is, you know, overly sharp. So I'm going to go to Filter, Blur, Gaussian Blur, and just give it 0.3 pixels of blur to just soften it up a bit. Nothing is perfectly sharp in reality. you know, when you take pictures with a actual camera. Okay, that is done. A final step, adding a little bit of grain to the image. Right now, everything is very clean, right? So all of everything that you see here is very, very straight. Oh, that's a mistake. But everything that you see here does not have any ISO grain that you would see if you were to take a photo of this. So I'm going to create a new layer. I'm going to Shift F5 to give it a 50% gray fill. Then I'm going to go to Filter, Noise, Add Noise, probably like 4%, honestly, something like that. 4 is a little bit too much. Let's go for 3% noise. This is unnatural. This kind of noise is unnatural. So I'll go back to Filter, Blur, Gaussian Blur, and hit it with 0.2 pixel blur, and then switch the blending mode to overlay. So this is with noise, this is without noise. With noise, without noise. I hope you can see it, I'm not sure. Let's find a place where this would be more visible and zoom in even further. That's with the noise, that's without the noise. With the noise, without. Okay, now you can see it, right? And that is that. That is it with this image. Just looking at it, I would say in terms of realism, in terms of, you know, how close we managed to get, I would call this, yeah, up to 95%, something like that. It's impossible to reach 100%. Well, it kind of is, but 100% would mean that you couldn't have any inaccuracies, and I don't feel like it's that you need to aim for 100% realism. I feel like 98, 97% gives you enough leeway, you know, to actually go a little bit more stylized with your renders. And that's the goal, that's the aim. So let me just do a quick time lapse going through every other picture, right, every other image, and then I will give you the last thoughts afterwards. All right, and before we finish up here, let me just introduce you to the 32-bit variation of how I color grade things or how I tone grade things. So this one was rendered out as an EXR image, which means that now if I go to Filter, Camera Raw Filter, this becomes, well, it's available, but also it will do more stuff to this image because it has the color and tonal depth to itself, right? So if I run this through Camera Raw Filter, here I can adjust the exposure, I can change the contrast and increase or decrease the highlights, you know, play with the shadows, adjust the temperature, make it warmer, make it colder, adjust the tint, make it greener or more purple, increase the vibrance or the colors, or dull down the colors if I want to. And also you have the possibility to, you know, increase the vignetting effect or add some grain to the image, and so on, right, to bring this as close as possible to the final outcome. And here I can see that this is currently running right into the HDR range, which is fine. I can just take this whole range here in the top and just bring it into SDR, because you kind of want it to do it this way so that once you convert this to 8-bit, it all converts appropriately, right? I hit OK. Now this is my color grading. I go to image mode, 8 bits channel. I just choose exposure and gamma, hit OK. And now we're good to go, right? We have this image color graded. And of course there are other changes that I would make to it. I would probably hit it with a dodge right here, to just be here as well, to just increase focus on this particular area. I think the grain right now is a little bit too intense. Perhaps I should hit it with a small blur. So Filter, Blur, Gaussian Blur, 0.3 pixels as per usual, just to soften it up a bit. And we're good to go. I feel like this is also not that bad, right? So time for final thoughts. So I'm often asked by students and watchers of this YouTube channel of what is the best software, rendering software out there, and what would I recommend to use to beginners or to professionals, it doesn't matter. And I think that's the wrong question to ask. I think the question is, what are the key ways of key portions of the process to focus on to make the renders better. The software does not make the renders better. The skills that you have and the workflow that you have does, right? In terms of the software, in terms of D5, I think this is the fastest way of how you can achieve the end result that is within these 90% realism levels, right? All other software that I use and that I render with requires more effort to reach, you know, this threshold. And I'm quite happy with how D5 has optimized the whole workflow and how quickly and easily it is to assemble a scene, get the materials in, get the filters in, adjust the light and so on. You saw me do it, right? You saw me go through these 5 steps and, you know, hopefully, at least from my perspective, end up with an output that is quite decent from a starting point that was far from decent. So I hope you enjoyed this one, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.